ZOMGitsCriss seems kind of stupid, but at least she understands the point of civilians having automatic weapons as being able to resist the government. That is first and foremost what this is about. It's not about hunting, right? It's not about protecting yourself from other civilians. It's about protecting yourself from the government and being able to override the results of an election outcome or some sort of law that people in the state congresses decide upon, being able to override those things with direct resistance. So you can think of it like militia nullification, right? We know how, for example, jury nullification, where if you're on a jury, you can decide that you oppose the law that someone is being prosecuted under and simply find him innocent, right? That is jury nullification, and you are allowed to do that. Don't let it. So if you're in a courtroom, be sure to abide by jury nullification, right? Be sure to know that you can decide that if you don't think the law is a good law, you can just find the person innocent. Anyway, but this is kind of like militia nullification, in opposition to the law, non-compliance with guns and the threat of guns. The point ZOMGits makes is that there's no way a bunch of random people with guns will be able to defeat an organized state army. For example, if, the U.S. federal government decides to send in the 1st Airborne, and the division commander of the 1st Airborne agrees to go in and agrees to follow the orders, then the militia is obviously screwed, right? And that's true. But that's not the point. If the army gets involved, it's over. The point is for the civilians to be able to outgun police, to be able to outgun the Department of Homeland Security, to be able to outgun SWAT teams and various other federal and state level departments. Okay, it is true that the U.S. Army may be called upon, but the U.S. Army is actually not accountable to the president. Right? Unlike all these other police forces, the U.S. Army is not accountable to the president or some department above them. The U.S. Army is accountable to the U.S. Constitution. They swear an oath not to the president, but to the Constitution. Okay? The U.S. Supreme Court, for example, they can say whatever they want to say. They can interpret the Constitution however they want to interpret it, but that's their opinion, and that's all it is. Right? The ultimate decider of what the U.S. Constitution actually says is the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now, and before people start thinking certain things about me, I actually oppose the U.S. Constitution. I believe the U.S. Constitution is a very bad document. All right, and I talk about that in another video for various reasons. I'm simply saying right here that in terms of interpreting what the U.S. Constitution says, the ultimate decider of what it says is the Joint Chiefs of Staff. At any moment, the generals can decide that the government is doing things wrong, and they can shut it down. They can send tanks down Pennsylvania Avenue, and that's basically it. Now, whether or not the Joint Chiefs of Staff think this way is another matter. Maybe they believe that they do serve under the president, at the pleasure of the president, but that's a fairly toothless idea. Because at any time, they can say that the president is misinterpreting the Constitution. And the Supreme Court can disagree, well, but so what? Right? And moreover, if it is determined that the president is acting in a way that is unconstitutional, it is their duty to overthrow the president. And anyone who doesn't join in, well, guess what they are? Any units that remain loyal to Congress or the President or Supreme Court, guess what they are? They're traitors. Okay? And so they would be subject to execution and would not be covered by the Geneva Convention. Now, if the U.S. Army decides to side with the federal government, well, there's really not much that can be done in that situation. Ultimately, the state belongs to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and anything that any other branch does is done because the generals allow it. Whether or not the generals think this way is another matter, but the hard facts of reality is that they got the guns and they can take over at any time. What ZOMGitsCriss is doing is she's thinking of the United States federal government as this homogenous thing when it is not. Okay, but on a smaller scale, what if the government decides to seize the gold like Roosevelt attempted to, or let's say that the state of California wants to impose some ridiculous tax. And there are people out in, say, the San Joaquin Valley that they just don't want to pay it. Well, without the ability to gun down SWAT teams and kill IRS agents, the tax revolt would be toothless, right? They need to have the ability to resist IRS agents in the same way that the IRS agents attempt to enforce the taxes, right? Guns for guns. And even if we assume that an armed population wouldn't necessarily be able to forcefully resist any of the laws that they oppose, they can still make the enforcement of those laws more expensive by turning an area into, Fallujah, right? By gunning down government agents and people who are known to have voted for the laws that they oppose. Right? It increases the cost of being an authoritarian piece of shit, either on the level of going around with guns and enforcing the laws, or on the level of voting those laws, which is similar to giving aid and comfort to the enemy. Right? So even if it is unsuccessful at stopping it outright, it can make it prohibitively expensive to do such things. Of course, ultimately, the U.S. federal government, as we know it, has to go, and that is my point of view. And disarming the general population is detrimental to that ultimate end, right? And so that's another argument against disarming the civilians. And we talked about gun control. Well, really, that's kind of a vague way to describe it. Really, because you're not disarming government agents, right? You're not disarming the military. Okay, who are you disarming? You're disarming this other group of people, right? You're disarming the civilians, all right? So it's not gun control, it's civilian disarmament.